It's 3:35, you're watching the Sarah Jane Me Show here on Sky News. Let's get more now on the December election and whether or not one party is going to be able to win a majority. In his final Commons showdown with Jeremy Corbyn before hitting the campaign trail, Prime Minister Boris Johnson pushed his agenda for getting Brexit done, while the Labour leader brought the conversation back to domestic policies and the NHS. We're joining us to discuss this from Westminster, Alex Dean, a former advisor to David Cameron, and The Guardian columnist and author Owen Jones. Good afternoon to you, gentlemen.
Hi, Sarah Jane.
Hooray, we've got a general election in December. Where shall we start? Alex, it's interesting, isn't it? Boris Johnson setting out his stall in the Commons this afternoon. He's pretty much dubbing it a Brexit election. Is that the right path for him to go down?
Oh, I think the government seeks to do two things. You're absolutely right. It wants to capitalise on its Brexit record. But the second thing is to talk about domestic agenda and what the government wants to do and has done in domestic politics. You can actually, I think, with some of the ministers who are responsible for major portfolios, take Matt Hancock in the NHS, very keen to talk about the issues that fall under their purview. And you can, their frustration at not being able to do that with some of your colleagues in the media is palpable. So I think the government wants to do both a Brexit discussion in election, but also to talk about domestic politics. And in both of those things, by the way, I'm comfortable and confident that they have a better line to take than the Labour Party.
It's both possible, Owen, because you know only too well, having stood out on Abingdon Green with Sky News many times, as soon as you start to talk about domestic policy, Brexit is shouted loudly over, whether it's by shouty Brexit man or just in the minds of the voters. Is it possible that this election can be about anything other than Brexit ultimately when people go to the polls?
Yeah, absolutely, because you can't disentangle Brexit from many of the, I guess, what we should describe as social crises enveloping the country. Look, we've gone through the longest squeeze in wages since the early 19th century, the worst squeeze in wages of any industrialised nation other than Greece. We've got a massive housing crisis. We've got communities which were stripped, bereft of secure work after massive deindustrialisation. These were all factors which led many people, not all, but many people, to vote for Brexit. I've gone to those communities, I've spoken to them, I've heard their loss, their sense of grief, the sense of their community being ripped away from them. And that led to a disillusionment, which led partly to some to decide, as they saw it, to vote against the status quo. So I'd say, but on that, the risk is, just quickly, as well as that, though, it needs to be an optimistic election. It needs to be about positive solutions, a genuine living wage, taxing the rich to invest in public services, to build the housing this country needs. And I think that's what Labour need to focus on. But if it's a Brexit election, it needs to talk about the crises that led partly to so many to vote in the way they did.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I'll talk to you a bit more about that, because if Brexit is entwined in everything domestically, do you think Labour have been clear enough about their position on Brexit going into this general election? And I ask that with the backdrop being the Conservatives saying, let's get Brexit done, and the Lib Dems, for example, saying we will revoke Article 50, there will be no Brexit if we are in power. Labour is somewhere in between. Is that going to cut through for voters if Brexit's intertwined with everything?
Well, the Lib Dem commitment is just completely undemocratic. Revoke without consulting the British people and getting a majority to support revoking Article 50. But some people want that. If you don't want Brexit, people may vote for the Lib Dems, because that is their choice. Well, some might, but most don't. And, you know, the only way, if for those who want a pathway back to Remain, the only way of doing that is to go back to the British people and get a majority to support that proposition. And the Tory proposition, by the way, is a con, because if we end up with their Brexit deal going through, there will be years of international trade negotiations and negotiations over the future relationship with the EU, which will continue to suck oxygen out of all the domestic issues we should be talking about. I really don't see, I have to say, why having a referendum between Remain and a customs union Brexit is complicated. It's very straightforward. There would be, within a few months, a referendum. If people want to stay, they can stay. If they don't, then they can leave.
Alex, your response to that, Owen, saying the Conservatives' position is a con?
No, Owen was setting out, I think, quite fairly what he thinks the Labour position is. We can all have a guess, or best guess at the Labour position. It may be actually more intellectually coherent, as he describes it, than the Liberal Democrat one. But at least in the defence of the Lib Dems, their position is clear and has been for some time. I think, notwithstanding what Owen says, there will be people who want to remain in the EU who will be tempted to vote Lib Dem, who might otherwise normally have voted Labour, who will lend their votes to the Lib Dems. And I think that real split on the broad left of the British political environment is going to lead to a thumping victory for Boris Johnson. Because on the other hand, whatever you think of Boris, and indeed whatever you think of Brexit, I think all of us can now see he's been trying to deliver it. And I think that support for the Brexit Party will dwindle because of that. So the split on the broad right will be much smaller than the split between the Labour Party and, however much Owen understandably wants to trash them, the Lib Dems on the left.
Well, I mean, partly I agree with Alex in a sense, which is the very real danger. Look, the secret weapon of Boris Johnson and his co-Prime Minister Dominic Cummings is Joe Swinson, the Liberal Democrats. They are praying like never, like nothing else, that in Tory Labour marginals, disillusioned Labour voters or former Labour voters will plump for the Lib Dems. And all I'd say is what will happen then, because the only route back, as anyone knows, the only possible route back for Remain is for Labour to form a government and have a referendum between Remain and a Brexit deal, which is a very straightforward policy. This performative ignorance about how that's a complicated policy I find utterly bewildering. But the danger is, the very real danger is, in a lot of key seats, I don't know, take Battersea, which went from a Tory seat to a Labour seat last time, take Putney, which went from a 10,000 Tory majority to 1,500 majority back in 2017. If the Lib Dems scoop a chunk of those votes, we're going to end up with a hard Brexit, hard right government being able to do exactly what it wants.
Okay,
and so I understand some people felt disillusioned with Labour over the whole Brexit issue, but I think they've kind of bent over backwards now, offering a referendum Remain on the ballot paper. But that is going to be the alternative.
Okay.
You're going to end up waking up with Boris Johnson as thumping majority, as Alex says.
OK, let's talk about how each party plans to go about getting a majority, because whatever party leader you speak to, they are convinced they are going to get a majority. No talks of coalitions, no talks of losing. They are going to win by a stonking majority, and not everyone can do that. So let's talk about the Conservatives first, Alex. Obviously, they're going into this election high in the polls. They've got a lead over Labour, but, you know, we've been there before when Theresa May called a general election, and we all know what happened after that. How are the Conservatives going to get a majority?
Well, absolutely right. And I think that we've got a lot of lessons to learn from the 2017. I hope lessons have been learned from the 2017 general election campaign, which was, to say the kindest thing about it, a poor one. Clearly, we mustn't overload the burden of the campaign on any given individual. I thought that Theresa May, for all her admirable efforts, was not the right person to have all the focus on. You recall that candidates were described as Theresa May's candidate in constituency X, Theresa May's team in constituency Y, rather than the Conservative Party. I don't think we're going to be seeing that, for all that I think Boris Johnson has rather more electoral pizzazz and charisma. But I think it's difficult to overstate the extent to which, in Westminster, after Boris has become leader of the Conservative Party, there has been, whether you like it or not, there's been more energy and vibrance and life in and around the Tory Party and the debates that it conducts. And I think that the Conservative Party will seek to take that into the election campaign and do what we've already discussed, that is to say, emphasise the commitment on, just emphasise the success on, as we see it, on the Brexit agenda, but also talk a lot about domestic issues and talk about success in domestic issues and future plans on
You can talk about
policy.
enthusiasm, and that kind of word comes up a lot with Boris Johnson. He's got enthusiasm, he gets people going. But the issue of trust is going to be a big one for the Conservatives at the election. How are you going to justify that on the doorsteps to voters? Because Boris Johnson failed on his big promise, which was to take the UK out of the EU on the 31st of November. Dead in a ditch, the Conservatives would be extinct if they didn't leave on the 31st. How are the Conservatives going to convince voters to trust them?
I think it's actually relatively simple, and I say this as a Brexiteer who wanted us to leave, actually not at the end of October. I wanted us to leave, of course, on the 29th of March, and I've been disappointed since. I think the answer for anyone explaining what's happened in defence of our Prime Minister is to point out the obvious. He tried his best, and he has been stymied, notwithstanding his best efforts. He absolutely strained every sinew to get us out of the European Union at the end of October, and the fact that we're not doing so isn't down to him, but down to others. And whatever you think of Boris more broadly, and whatever you think of Brexit, I don't think there's many left in the country who would think he's not genuinely earnest about trying to deliver that. OK, let's bring in Owen there. I mean, the Conservatives, by the sound of it, are going to go into this campaign and say we didn't leave because it's Labour's fault, it's the Lib Dems' fault. How are Labour going to turn around what the polls say? Because the polls aren't particularly good for Labour. Jeremy Corbyn, in particular, his polling ratings are not good at all, worst in history for an opposition leader. How are Labour going to turn all of that around and get a majority and get into number 10?
Well, firstly, on the Tory Brexit deal, what they did is capitulate to the EU's red lines, regurgitate a deal that the EU offered a year and a half ago, which Theresa May said no British Prime Minister could offer, threw his DUP allies overboard. They were the latest to discover you can't trust a single word that Boris Johnson says. In terms of what Labour has to do, I think, firstly, in terms of those who've abandoned Labour, disillusioned over Brexit, it has to say you've got a pathway back to Remain if Labour win, your only pathway back with a referendum with Remain on the ballot paper. They've got to link issues to Brexit. So Jeremy Corbyn went in hard at Prime Minister's questions on the prospect of a US trade deal which opens up the National Health Service to US multinational corporations. And also, because the Tories have decided to put the NHS centre stage, then Labour can talk about a record, a 10-year record of cuts, of privatisation, because it's 10 years of Tory rule at stake. But what Labour have to do above all else is be optimistic. They have to say, look, This is an extraordinarily wealthy country, and it's being held back its potential. When actually, if those at the top who are booming like never before paid a fairer amount of tax, that could be used, not just to deal with a crumbling NHS and education system, but to make them something we're proud of, to scrap tuition fees, to bring utilities under public ownership,
just
to,
one final question
have a
for you
genuine
both.
living wage.
OK, just one final question for you both, because we're running out of time. Is this election going to be the miracle on 34th Street or the nightmare before Christmas? And I ask that in relation to tone, because we've had a lot of MPs, 2 today, one including Amber Rudd, stepping down for various different reasons, but the theme that keeps getting repeated is the abuse that MPs face, and a lot of that comes back down to the Brexit issue. They say, look, it's just not worth it, it's ruining our lives. So what kind of campaign are the Conservatives and Labour going to fight? Alex, come to you first.
I think it's going to be a positive campaign from the Conservative Party, and one thing I do agree on with Owen, we don't agree on the solutions, but we agree about positivity and optimism for the future of our country. I think we've got a great future in our country, and I think if there is negativity in this campaign, not only will it not come from the Conservative Party, but it may also come from disillusioned former members of the Labour Party. Contrary to what Owen says, it's not just Brexit that's driven them away, it's institutional anti-Semitism too, and there's a lot to answer for on that front, and I'd love to know what Owen thinks about it.
Yeah, I mean, how can we take the nastiness out of the political discourse at the moment?
Well, anti-Semitism needs to be remorselessly defeated wherever it manifests itself. In terms of the sheer nastiness, we've had a government which has whipped up a vicious populist attack, particularly, this talk of surrender bill, of enemies of the people, that's what we've heard from the Tories, crush the saboteurs from the Tory press. That has whipped up and emboldened an increasingly violent far right. I'm particularly worried about the misogyny that's directed towards women MPs. And I think in terms of a Christmas election, what should we think about at Christmas? It's the season of goodwill, it's of community, it's thinking of those in need. And those are the themes that I think Labour should talk about. A positive, happy, but thinking, because at Christmas, we think about caring and looking after each other. And that's the sort of message I think that needs to be at the core of the campaign.
Yeah, a bit of Christmas spirit into the campaign trail. Owen Jones and Alex Dean, thank you very much for your thoughts on the forthcoming Christmas election. December the 12th is the date for your diary.